The woman's voice came through the cabin wall like a prayer spoken into stone. "Sir, if I birth a girl, they'll hang me." Elias Cade stopped mid-step on the porch, his hand frozen on the doorframe. The wood was still warm from the afternoon sun, but the air had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with weather. He'd ridden 3 days through alkali flats and sage country to reach this place, a midwife's cabin tucked into the foothills, where the land began to remember what green looked like. He'd come because a rider had found him at a trading post in Silver Creek, pressed a folded note into his palm, and vanished before Elias could ask questions. The note had been simple. "Woman in labor. No doctor within 50 miles. You delivered foals. You'll do." Elias wasn't a doctor. He was a drifter with steady hands and a reputation for keeping horses alive when other men would have put them down. But he'd pulled enough breech calves and tangled foals to know the rhythm of life trying to force its way into the world. He didn't know why that made him the man for this, but the rider's desperation had been enough. Now, standing outside the cabin, he understood desperation wore more than one face. Inside, a lantern flickered. Shadows moved across the walls, 2 figures, maybe 3. He could hear the woman's labored breathing, the kind that came in short bursts between waves of pain. Someone else murmured, low and constant, words he couldn't make out but recognized as the sound of comfort being offered and failing to land. Elias pushed the door open slowly. The room smelled of sweat and sage smoke. A woman lay on a narrow bed against the far wall, her face pale and damp, her hands gripping the quilt beneath her like it was the only thing tethering her to the earth. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes held something older, something that had seen too much and expected worse. Beside her stood another woman, older, grey-haired, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. She glanced at Elias with a look that was equal parts relief and warning. "You the one they sent for?" she asked. "I am." Elias stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He set his saddlebag down on the table, careful not to make noise. "Name's Cade." "Miriam," the older woman said. She didn't offer her hand. "This is Rebecca." Rebecca's eyes found him then, wide and dark and filled with a fear that made his chest tighten. She tried to sit up, but another contraction seized her, and she gasped, curling inward. Miriam moved to her side, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. "Easy now. Breathe through it." Elias waited until the contraction passed before he spoke. "How long has she been laboring?" "Since yesterday morning," Miriam said quietly. "It's coming, but slow. Too slow." He nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "I'll need water, clean cloths, and light more of it." Miriam gestured to a basin in the corner and a stack of linens on a chair. Elias moved with the efficiency of a man who'd done this before, though never with stakes like these. He washed his hands in the basin, the water cold and sharp, and dried them on a cloth that smelled faintly of lavender. When he turned back, Rebecca was watching him. "You heard what I said," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than breath. "When you were outside," Elias met her gaze and didn't look away. "I heard. Then you know." Her hands twisted in the quilt. "If it's a girl, they'll come for me, for her, for anyone who helped." "Who's they?" Elias asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer. Miriam spoke before Rebecca could. "The Brethren of the Narrow Gate." She said the name like it tasted of ash. "They run the valley east of here. Rebecca's husband." She paused, her jaw tightening. "He's one of them." Elias had heard whispers of the Brethren, a sect that had carved out a piece of high desert and called it holy ground. They kept to themselves, mostly, but stories filtered out, stories of rigid law, of punishment for deviation, of women who disappeared and men who spoke in scripture and held rifles like scepters. "They believe daughters are a curse," Rebecca said, her voice steadier now, though her hands still shook. "A test from God. If a woman births a girl, it's proof she's impure. They say she has to atone." "Atone how?" Elias asked, though he didn't want to know. Rebecca's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "Hanging, in the square, in front of everyone." The words settled into the room like stones dropped into still water. Elias felt the weight of them, the impossible cruelty, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. He'd seen hard men do hard things in his years, drifting claim jumpers, range wars, blood feuds that burned through families like wildfire. But this was different. This was law dressed up as faith, and it was colder than anything he'd known. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked quietly. Rebecca's laugh was bitter and broken. "Where?" They watched the roads. "My husband. He'd find me. And if he didn't, the others would. She closed her eyes. I tried once. Got 10 miles before they brought me back. Miriam's hand rested on Rebecca's shoulder, firm and grounding. She sent word to me 3 weeks ago. We've been preparing. Preparing for what? Elias asked. For you, Miriam said simply. Or someone like you. Someone who doesn't belong to them. Another contraction came, harder this time, and Rebecca cried out. Elias moved to the bedside, his hands steady as he checked her pulse, her breathing, the shape of her belly. The baby was positioned right, as far as he could tell, but the labor was dragging. She was exhausted, and exhaustion could turn dangerous fast. Rebecca, he said, his voice low and calm, I'm going to help you through this, but I need you to trust me. She looked at him through the pain, searching his face for something truth, maybe, or just the absence of cruelty. Do you swear? She whispered. Elias didn't hesitate. I swear. She nodded, and for the first time since he'd entered the cabin, something in her expression softened. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, long and lonesome. Elias glanced at the window, at the darkening sky beyond, and wondered how much time they had before the world outside came looking. He turned back to Rebecca and Miriam, his jaw set. Let's bring this baby into the world, he said, and in the flickering lantern light, with the weight of an unjust law pressing down on all of them, they began. The hours bled together in the small cabin, measured only by Rebecca's breathing and the slow march of contractions that came and went, like distant thunder. Elias worked with the focused precision of a man who knew that hesitation could cost a life. He'd seen mares go down during hard births, seen calves stillborn because someone waited too long to act. He wouldn't let that happen here. Miriam stayed close, her hands moving in rhythm with his passing cloths, adjusting the lantern, murmuring encouragement to Rebecca when the pain became too much. She was steady, this woman, and Elias found himself grateful for her presence. She knew things he didn't, how to read the small signs in Rebecca's face, when to push and when to let her rest. It's turning, Elias said quietly, his hand pressed gently against Rebecca's belly. Won't be long now. Rebecca's eyes fluttered open. Her face was drawn, pale as parchment, but there was still fight in her. How do you know? Because I've done this before, he said. Not with people, maybe, but with creatures that want to live just as much as any of us. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Another contraction came, and this time Elias felt the shift, the baby moving lower, finding its way. That's it, he said. You're doing fine. Just breathe. Rebecca gripped Miriam's hand so hard her knuckles went white. She breathed through the pain, her jaw clenched, her body shaking with the effort. When it passed, she collapsed back against the pillow, gasping. I can't, she whispered. I can't do this. You can, Miriam said firmly. And you will. Elias poured water into a cup and held it to Rebecca's lips. She drank slowly, her eyes never leaving his. When she finished, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. If it's a girl, you have to take her. Elias went still. Take her where? He asked. Anywhere, Rebecca said. Away from here. Away from him. Her hand found his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Promise me. Elias looked at Miriam, but the older woman's expression was unreadable. He turned back to Rebecca, his mind racing. He'd come here to deliver a baby, nothing more. He hadn't signed up for this, for running, for defying men who'd kill over doctrine, for carrying a newborn across hostile country with no plan and no destination. But he'd also sworn to help her, and in that moment, looking into her terrified, desperate eyes, he realized that help didn't end when the baby took its first breath. If it comes to that, he said slowly, I'll make sure she's safe. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, releasing his wrist. Thank you, she whispered. The next contraction came fast, and this time Elias knew they were close. He positioned himself, his hands ready, his focus absolute. Miriam, hold the lantern steady. Rebecca, when I say push, you push with everything you have. Understand? She nodded, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Now, Elias said. Rebecca pushed, her face contorting with effort. Elias guided the baby carefully, his hands sure despite the fear coiling in his gut. The head emerged first, slick and small, and then the shoulders. He worked quickly, supporting the infant as it slid free into his hands. For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then the baby cried a sharp, piercing wail that cut through the stillness like a blade. Elias looked down at the tiny, squirming life in his hands, and his heart sank. It was a girl. He didn't say it aloud. He didn't have to. Rebecca knew. Miriam knew. The knowledge settled over them like a shroud. Miriam moved quickly, taking the baby and wrapping her in a clean cloth. She wiped the infant's face gently, her movements tender despite the fear in her eyes. The baby's cries softened into small, hiccuping sounds, and Miriam cradled her close. Rebecca was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "Let me hold her," she said. "Please." Miriam hesitated, then placed the baby in Rebecca's arms. The young mother looked down at her daughter, her expression breaking into something raw and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. She touched the baby's tiny hand, and the infant's fingers curled instinctively around hers. "She's perfect," Rebecca whispered. Elias turned away, his throat tight. He walked to the window and stared out into the dark. The wind had died down, and the night was still, too still. He could feel time running out, could feel the weight of what came next, pressing down on all of them. "What do we do?" Miriam asked quietly. Elias didn't answer right away. He thought of the men in the valley, of the laws they upheld with scripture and rope. He thought of Rebecca's husband, whoever he was, and the certainty that he'd come looking. He thought of the baby, small and helpless, whose only crime was being born. "We get them out," he said finally. "Tonight." Miriam shook her head. "Rebecca can't travel, not yet. She's too weak." "She'll have to," Elias said, turning back to face them. "Because if we stay here, they'll find us, and when they do, they won't show mercy." Rebecca looked up from the baby, her face pale but resolute. "He's right. They'll come. Maybe not tonight, but soon." "Where will you go?" Miriam asked. "West," Elias said. "Past the mountains. There's a town called Redstone, small, but far enough from here that the brethren won't reach. I know people there. They'll help." Miriam crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "That's 3 days' ride, maybe 4. With a newborn and a woman who just gave birth?" "You have a better idea?" Elias asked. She didn't answer. Rebecca shifted the baby in her arms, her voice soft but firm. "I'll make it. I have to." Elias met her gaze and saw the determination there, fierce and unyielding. He nodded. "Then we leave before dawn," he said. "Miriam, pack what you can, food, water, blankets. I'll ready the horses." Miriam hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But you'd better be damn sure about this, Cade, because if they catch you, they won't just hang Rebecca. They'll hang all of us." "I know," Elias said quietly. He looked at the baby in Rebecca's arms, at the small life that had already cost so much, and would cost more before this was over. And he thought about the men who'd written laws that valued doctrine over mercy, who'd turned faith into a weapon and called it holy. He thought about them, and he made his choice. "We leave in 2 hours," he said. "Get ready." Outside, the night remained still, but somewhere in the distance, a dog barked sharp and insistent, like a warning, and Elias knew their time was running out. They almost made it. The horses were saddled, the supplies packed into saddlebags that hung heavy with dried meat, cornmeal, and canteens filled to the brim. Miriam had fashioned a sling from blankets, something Rebecca could wear to keep the baby close against her chest while they rode. The infant slept now, exhausted from her first hours in the world, her tiny breaths barely audible in the quiet cabin. Elias stood by the door, scanning the darkness beyond the porch. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, but that was good. Darkness would hide them as they moved through the hills. He'd mapped the route in his mind west through the canyon pass, then north along the ridge, where the terrain was too rough for wagons but manageable on horseback. If they kept moving, if Rebecca held up, they'd reach the foothills by morning and be halfway to Redstone by nightfall. "We're ready," Miriam said behind him. Elias turned. Rebecca was on her feet, pale and unsteady but upright. The baby was secured in the sling, tucked against her mother's chest, and Rebecca's hand rested protectively over the small bundle. She looked fragile, like a strong wind might knock her over, but her eyes were clear. "Can you ride?" Elias asked. "I'll ride," Rebecca said simply. He nodded and picked up the saddlebags. "Stay close. Don't push the horses. If you feel faint, tell me. We'll stop." "We won't stop," Rebecca said. Elias met her gaze and saw the steel beneath the exhaustion. He didn't argue. They stepped out onto the porch, moving as quietly as they could. The horses waited in the small corral beside the cabin Elias's roan and 2 smaller mares that Miriam kept for travel. He secured the saddlebags, and helped Rebecca into the saddle, his hand steady as she settled the baby against her. Miriam mounted her own horse, her face grim. "If we're doing this, we do it fast. No second chances." "Understood," Elias said. He swung into his saddle and took the lead, guiding the roan down the narrow path that led away from the cabin. The night air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and pine. Behind them, the cabin stood dark and silent, already fading into the past. They rode for 20 minutes in silence, the only sounds the soft clop of hooves on packed earth and the occasional creak of leather. Elias kept his eyes on the trail ahead, watching for loose rock or deadfall that might trip the horses. His hand rested near the revolver on his hip, a battered Colt that had seen better days but still fired true. He didn't expect to need it. Then he heard the hoofbeats. At first, he thought it was an echo, his own horses mirrored in the canyon walls. But the rhythm was wrong, too fast, too many. He pulled the roan to a stop and raised his hand, signaling the others to halt. "What is it?" Miriam whispered. Elias didn't answer. He strained to listen, his pulse quickening. The hoofbeats were growing louder, coming from the east from the direction of the valley. "Riders," he said quietly. "At least 4, maybe more." Rebecca's face went white. "They found us." "Not yet," Elias said. He scanned the terrain, his mind racing. They were halfway through the canyon, the walls rising steep on either side. There was no cover here, no place to hide. If the riders reached them in the open, they'd be trapped. "There," Miriam said, pointing ahead. "The split in the trail. We can take the north path, it's rougher, but it'll get us out of sight." Elias nodded. "Move." Now, they spurred the horses forward, pushing faster than was safe in the dark. The north path was narrow and treacherous, littered with loose stone and sharp turns, but it climbed quickly, taking them up into the rocks where the shadows were thicker. Elias led the way, his eyes darting between the trail and the canyon below. The hoofbeats were closer now, echoing off the stone. He could hear voices, men calling to each other, sharp and commanding. And then, cutting through the night, a single shout that made his blood run cold. "Miriam's cabin. Check the cabin." Rebecca gasped, and Elias glanced back. She was slumped in the saddle, one hand pressed to her side, her face twisted in pain. The baby stirred against her chest, letting out a soft whimper. "Keep moving," Elias said, his voice urgent. "We're almost there." But even as he said it, he knew they weren't. The trail narrowed further ahead, pinching into a bottleneck that would force them to move single file. If the riders reached them there, it would be over. They broke through the bottleneck just as the first torch appeared below. Elias pulled his horse to a stop at the top of the ridge and looked back. He could see them now, 6 riders, maybe 7, their torches casting wild, flickering light across the canyon floor. They were moving fast, their horses dark shapes against the stone, and they were heading straight for the split in the trail. "They're coming," Miriam said, her voice tight. Elias drew his revolver, the weight of it cold and familiar in his hand. "Get Rebecca into the trees. I'll hold them here." "You can't," Miriam started. "Go," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Miriam hesitated, then nodded. She took Rebecca's horse by the reins and led her into the pine forest that clung to the ridge, disappearing into the shadows. Elias dismounted and crouched behind a boulder, his eyes fixed on the trail below. The riders were closer now, their voices loud and angry. He could make out words: traitor, heretic, find her, and beneath it all, the cold certainty of men who believed they were doing God's work. He didn't want to shoot. Killing would only bring more of them, and more after that. But he also knew that if they reached Rebecca and the baby, there would be no mercy. The first rider reached the bottleneck, his torch held high. Elias aimed carefully, not at the man but at the horse's hooves. He fired once, the shot cracking through the night like thunder. The horse reared, panicked, and the rider fought to stay in the saddle. The others pulled up short, shouting, their torches swinging wildly. Elias fired again, this time splintering a rock near the lead horse's head. The animal bolted sideways, blocking the trail. Chaos erupted below. The riders struggled to control their mounts, their voices rising in anger and confusion. Elias didn't wait to see more. He swung into his saddle and spurred the roan into the trees, following the path Miriam and Rebecca had taken. Behind him, the shouting grew louder, and he knew they'd be coming. But he'd bought them time. He just hoped it was enough. They rode until the horses couldn't go any further. The forest had thickened around them, the trees closing in like a wall of shadow and silence. Elias found a hollow beneath an outcropping of rock, hidden from the trail by dense underbrush and the skeletal remains of a fallen pine. It wasn't much, but it would shield them from sight, and right now, that was all that mattered. He helped Rebecca down from the saddle. She was trembling, her legs barely holding her weight, and when he caught her arm, he felt the fever beginning to rise beneath her skin. Miriam was already spreading blankets on the ground, her movements quick and efficient, despite the exhaustion etched into her face. "Lay her down," Miriam said quietly. "Easy now." Elias lowered Rebecca onto the blankets, and she curled onto her side, cradling the baby against her. The infant was crying softly, a thin, persistent sound that cut through the stillness. Rebecca tried to soothe her, her hand moving in slow circles over the tiny back, but the baby wouldn't quiet. "She's hungry," Miriam said. "Rebecca, can you feed her?" Rebecca nodded weakly and shifted, adjusting the sling so the baby could nurse. The crying stopped almost immediately, replaced by the small, rhythmic sounds of feeding. Rebecca closed her eyes, her face relaxing for the first time since they'd fled the cabin. Elias moved to the edge of the hollow, his revolver still in his hand. He listened to the forest, the rustle of wind through the pines, the distant call of an owl, the faint creak of branches settling. There were no hoofbeats, no voices. For now, they were alone. "How far do you think we got?" Miriam asked, her voice low. 10 miles, maybe," Elias said. "Not far enough. Will they follow us into the forest?" "If they're smart, they'll wait for daylight," Elias said. "But smart doesn't always mean cautious." Miriam sat down beside Rebecca, her hand resting on the younger woman's shoulder. "You did well tonight, both of you." Rebecca opened her eyes, her gaze finding Elias across the hollow. "You saved us," she said softly. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Elias said simply. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" It was a fair question. Elias had asked himself the same thing as they'd ridden through the dark, as he'd fired shots to scatter men he didn't know for a woman he'd met only hours before. He could have walked away, could have delivered the baby and left, told himself he'd done enough. But he hadn't. "Because it's wrong," he said finally. "What they do, what they believe. It's wrong, and someone had to say so." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "My husband, he's not a bad man, not in his heart, but he believes. He believes with everything he is. And that belief," she trailed off, her voice breaking, "makes him dangerous," Elias finished quietly. She nodded. "He'll come for me, for her. He won't stop." "Then we won't stop either," Elias said. Miriam stood and walked over to him, her arms crossed against the cold. "You know what this means, don't you? If we keep going, there's no turning back. They'll hunt us. They'll call us outlaws, heretics. Worse. You'll be marked. Cade." "I've been marked before," Elias said. "I'll manage." "And the baby?" Miriam asked. "What happens to her when this is over?" Elias looked back at Rebecca and the infant, so small and fragile in her mother's arms. He thought about the world waiting for that child, a world that had already decided she was a curse before she'd taken her first breath. He thought about the men who'd hang her mother for bringing her into it, and the doctrine that called such cruelty holy. "She gets to live," Elias said. "She gets to grow up somewhere safe. Somewhere no one tells her she's anything but wanted." Miriam's expression softened. "You're a good man, Cade. Foolish, maybe, but good." "Being good doesn't keep people alive," Elias said. "Being stubborn does." She almost smiled at that. "Then let's be stubborn." They sat in silence for a while, the three of them, listening to the forest and the soft sounds of the baby nursing. The fever in Rebecca's skin had cooled slightly, and some color had returned to her face. Elias allowed himself to hope, just a little, that they might actually make it. Then Rebecca spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. "Tell me about Redstone, the place we're going." Elias leaned back against the rock, his eyes on the dark canopy above. "It's small, a mining town mostly, though the mines are played out now. People there are, practical. They don't ask too many questions, and they don't care much for outsiders telling them how to live." "Sounds like my kind of place," Rebecca said softly. "There's a woman there," Elias continued. "Name's Clara. She runs a boarding house. She'll take you in, help you get on your feet. She's done it before for people running from things they couldn't fight." "And you trust her?" Rebecca asked. "With my life," Elias said. Rebecca nodded slowly, her hand moving to cradle the baby's head. "What do I tell her? About all this?" "The truth," Elias said. "Or as much of it as you want. Clara doesn't judge. She just helps." "And what about you?" Rebecca asked, her eyes meeting his. "Will you stay? In Redstone?" Elias hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been focused on getting them out, on keeping them alive, on outrunning the men who'd come hunting. But the question hung in the air now, and he didn't have an answer. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe for a while." Rebecca smiled, faint but real. "I'd like that." The baby had fallen asleep, her small body warm and still against her mother's chest. Rebecca looked down at her, and for the first time, Elias saw something other than fear in her expression. He saw love. He saw hope. "She needs a name," Miriam said softly. Rebecca thought for a moment, her fingers tracing the curve of the baby's cheek. "Grace," she said. "Her name is Grace." Elias nodded. It was a good name. A name that spoke of something unearned and freely given, something the world outside this hollow didn't understand. "Grace," he repeated quietly. And in that moment, beneath the stars and the shelter of ancient trees, they were just three people and a newborn child no longer running, but resting, no longer afraid, but ready. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. They reached Redstone on the fourth day. The journey had been brutal. Rebecca's strength had waned and returned in cycles, her body fighting to recover even as they pushed forward. Miriam had ridden beside her the entire way, watchful and steady, and Elias had scouted ahead, always listening for the sounds of pursuit that never came. The brethren had searched the forest, he was sure of it, but the mountains were vast, and the trail they'd taken was known only to those who'd lived in that country long enough to learn its secrets. By the time the town appeared in the distance, a scattering of wooden buildings along a dry riverbed, smoke rising from chimneys, the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer ringing against iron, Elias felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. They rode down the main street slowly, drawing a few curious glances but nothing more. Redstone was the kind of place where strangers came and went, and folks had learned not to pry. Elias led them to a two-story building at the far end of town, painted white but weathered grey by sun and wind. A sign hung above the door, "Clara's boarding house." He dismounted and tied the horses, then helped Rebecca down. She was pale and exhausted, but she held Grace tightly, her eyes scanning the building with cautious hope. "This is it?" she asked. "This is it," Elias said. The door opened before he could knock, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pinned up and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Elias first, then at Rebecca and Miriam, and finally at the small bundle in Rebecca's arms. "Cade," she said, her voice warm but edged with concern. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Clara," Elias said, "I need a favor." Clara's gaze lingered on Rebecca, taking in the exhaustion, the feverish flush, the way she held the baby like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She didn't ask questions, she just nodded. "Come inside," she said. "All of you." The boarding house was clean and warm, with rooms that smelled of wood smoke and bread. Clara led Rebecca to a small room on the second floor, helped her into bed, and took Grace, while Miriam tended to Rebecca's wounds and exhaustion with practiced hands. Elias waited downstairs in the kitchen, his hat in his hands, listening to the muffled sounds of movement above. When Clara finally came back down, she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him at the table. "You want to tell me what this is about?" she asked quietly. Elias told her everything. The cabin, the labor, the law that sentenced mothers of daughters to death, the brethren and their torches and their certainty, the ride through the dark, the shots fired, the desperate flight through the forest. He left nothing out, and Clara listened without interrupting, her expression growing harder with each detail. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she set her cup down and looked at him. "They'll come looking," she said. "Maybe," Elias said, "but they won't find her here, not if we're careful. And if they do, then I'll deal with it," Elias said simply. Clara studied him, her sharp eyes searching his face. "You're a good man, Cade, but this isn't your fight." "It is now," he said. She nodded slowly, and something like approval flickered in her expression. "All right, she can stay as long as she needs. I'll put the word out anyone asking about a woman and a baby. I don't know anything." "Thank you," Elias said. "Don't thank me yet," Clara said. You just brought a war to my doorstep. Let's hope we can keep it outside. Upstairs, Rebecca was sitting up in bed, the baby cradled in her arms. Miriam sat beside her, and when Elias entered, both women looked at him. Clara says you can stay, Elias said. As long as you need. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, unable to speak. Miriam stood and crossed to Elias, her expression serious. What about you? Where will you go? I'm staying, Elias said. For now, at least, until I'm sure they're safe. And after that? Miriam asked. Elias shrugged. I'll figure it out. Miriam smiled faintly. Stubborn, she said. You said it yourself, Elias replied. He stayed in Redstone for 6 weeks. During that time, Rebecca recovered slowly but steadily. Grace grew stronger, her cries louder, her tiny hands grasping at the world with increasing curiosity. Clara's boarding house became a haven, a place where the harsh laws of the valley couldn't reach, where a mother and daughter could simply exist without fear. Elias worked odd jobs around town, fixing fences, shoeing horses, helping at the general store. He kept his ear to the ground, listening for news from the east, but none came. The brethren, it seemed, had either given up or decided the mountains were too treacherous to risk further pursuit. One evening, as the sun set over the dry riverbed, Elias found Rebecca sitting on the porch, Grace asleep in her arms. You're leaving, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elias leaned against the porch railing and nodded. Time, I moved on. Will you come back? Rebecca asked. Maybe, Elias said. Someday. Rebecca looked down at Grace, her expression soft. She'll grow up knowing what you did. I'll make sure of it. You don't have to, Elias said. I do, Rebecca said firmly, because she needs to know that the world isn't just cruel laws and cruel men. She needs to know there are people who'll stand up, even when it costs them. Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Rebecca stood and placed a hand on his arm. Thank you, Elias Cade, for everything. Take care of her, Elias said quietly. Both of you. We will, Rebecca said, and she meant it. Years later, a young woman would stand in the doorway of Clara's boarding house, her dark hair tied back, her eyes steady and strong. She'd ask about a man named Cade, a drifter who'd passed through when she was just a baby. Clara would smile and tell her the story. About the night he delivered a daughter when the world said she shouldn't exist. About the ride through the dark, the shots fired to buy time, the choice to stand against cruelty even when it would have been easier to walk away. And Grace, now grown, now free, would listen. And she'd understand that her life had been a gift, hard-won and fiercely protected. And somewhere out on the trail, beneath wide skies and endless horizon, Elias Cade would ride on, still drifting, still stubborn, still choosing mercy over doctrine every single time.